How I Became an Inventor by Robert Helm. Published by Parabliss Publishing House, Richmond Heights, Ohio 43379. ISBN number 13:978-0615629568. How I Became an Inventor. At the beginning, there were many things that led me down the path of becoming an inventor. When I was a little boy, I tried to fix, or at least figure out what was wrong with most of the things that got broken around our house. My specialty was electronics and bikes. I guess I was a junk doctor at an early age because sometimes it seemed like I was performing open heart surgery. As I got older, the projects changed from fixing up bikes and TVs to building home stereo systems. I was about 16 years old when I stumbled onto what became one of my most favorite discoveries. It was hooking up Christmas lights to the speaker output of my stereo system. One day I was hooking up a new pair of speakers. As I attempted to connect the wires, I accidentally touched them and they made a spark. Before this happened, I had no idea how music traveled through a wire to make sound, but I do now. The spark from the wires made me wonder, what if? A few minutes later, I found some old Christmas lights, cut the wires, and connected them to the stereo. Once I made the connections and turned it on, the lights began flashing to the beat. At that moment, I felt like what I refer to as an Einstein moment. This new discovery made for a very successful party the following weekend. Spring of 1996, I was a senior in high school trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I really didn't have a lot of curriculum classes to take because I took a full load my junior year. So I took auto shop and English. My interest in fixing cars was minimal, but our school was small and didn't have many elective classes. One day during auto shop class, we had a representative from a trade school come in to give a presentation. This gentleman was from a well-known school that boasted about their auto mechanics program. I personally liked the idea of fixing cars, but really had no interest in doing it myself. After the presentation, he began talking about their heating and air conditioning school. This caught my attention for a few reasons. Number one, it did not require any more math or English or science. Two, you can work anywhere in the world. Three, you always have a job. Somewhere in his presentation, he made a statement that an HVACR technician is like being a doctor. I was hooked. I graduated from high school that summer and was enrolled to become an HVACR superstar for the fall term. Throughout the summer, I was so excited about going away to school because it was in the big city. I remained excited until about 2 weeks before it was time to go to school. That's when the idea of leaving home really set in. September arrived quickly, and one of my classmates and I headed off to college. We arrived and got settled into our first apartment. Things were going as planned. We met other students from all over the U.S. It was not too bad though, because I think everyone was nervous at first. On our first day of school, it was apparent that we were in the military. At least that's how it felt. The instructor began going over the rules, which included you must always wear a pressed shirt with slacks, and you must always keep your hairline and mustache neatly trimmed. He ended with, by the way, you'll be inspected every day before class, and if you do not meet the requirement, you will be sent home. I grew to appreciate this type of environment because there was definitely a need for discipline and consistency. About halfway through the school year, we had finished up the theoretical stuff and were now knee-deep in furnaces and air conditioners. I must say, the time we spent in the shop was my most favorite part of school. This was where I had the opportunity to apply the information we learned in class. The hands-on part is where it all came together for me. It seems like yesterday, or should I say 2 days ago now, I was in the advanced electrical circuitry class, and the instructor was explaining how to understand electrical terms. He used the flow of water to draw a comparison. At this point, the light came on, and it all made sense to me. Almost everything is a result of a process, and a process is the steps that it takes to complete an action. Once I understood this concept, troubleshooting became much easier for me. Instead of pulling out my test meter every time, I would just watch and observe what the system was doing compared to what it should be doing sequentially. By the time I graduated, my confidence was so high, I felt like I could do any job that I wanted to. So I applied for jobs in electronics repair and HVACR. 1 week later, I had my first real job. It was with one of the largest general retailers in the nation as a service technician. Not only could you buy a treadmill or a stove from us, but if it broke, we could come and fix it. A really cool concept if you ask me. I had this job for about 1.5 years before I got fired. It started on what was to be a terrible Christmas day. I was on call for emergency service and received a call for no heat. On any other normal Christmas day, this would have not been a problem. But when I called to follow up with a customer, she indicated that she had no heat in her laundry room. That was the first indicator that this wasn't going to be a very good service call. When I arrived to the customer's house, it was a big 10,000 square foot home. My first thought was, wow, I guess I see why they need heat for the laundry room. At least until I saw it. The laundry room was about the size of a big closet, and it had a furnace tucked back in the corner. It had the most beautiful yellow flames that I ever saw. Hint, hint, carbon monoxide. To make a long and embarrassing story short, the furnace was full of soot, and the flames were rolling out of the front. It had a plugged heat exchanger, so I cleaned it like never before and got the heat working great. About 2 weeks later, I got called into the boss's office, and he told me I was being released from employment because I caused something like $15,000 to $20,000 worth of damage. The soot that I thought I was cleaning up was really blowing into the air and traveled throughout the house, resulting in a new paint job, new furniture, and a cleaning crew. Oops. Well, I guess it's time for a brief swim in the unemployment pool. The technical training I received was great, but we didn't spend a whole lot of time on the proper procedures for soot removal. That was okay though, because it didn't take long before I found another job. It was just like the recruiter said from college. There is always a need for qualified HVACR technicians. The company that ended up hiring me was questionable though. I remember one of the conversations I had with the owner. He explained how a gentleman with bad road rage had harassed him and his girlfriend once. So he made a call to his pops. The next day they found the guy dead. End of story. Boy, things a big city has to offer. I quit that company the following week. The next company I went to work for was quite different than any other I had worked for in the past. This company only worked with high velocity heating and cooling systems. What made them unique is their products could be installed almost anywhere. It consisted of a small air handler inside and an outdoor coil. Their supply air ducts were small and flexible so they could be run almost anywhere within the structure. This system is a really good solution to a common problem found in older homes that have boiler heating systems and no air conditioners. They are also great for multi-level high-rise living. I'm sharing this part of my story to demonstrate that solutions are created to address specific problems all the time. My employment was short-lived with this company as a result of two incidents. The first one could happen to anybody. We were installing an air handler in the attic of a home. It was about 114 degrees up there. At these temperatures, it was only possible for us to work at 15-minute intervals. On my second or third time up, I was laying across the ceiling joist in a pile of blown insulation, cutting the supply ducts. I rolled over to grab the aluminum tape used to seal air leaks and inadvertently got it on the side of my lips. It almost ripped my lips off. The second incident would make anyone reconsider their employment. I was on a job that required two technicians. One had to be of small stature. That's me. This job was downtown in a high-rise penthouse on the 30th floor. My job as the little guy was to climb up in the ceiling cavity about 3 feet high and lean out the window to attach refrigeration gauges to the condensing unit. Did I mention that I was on the 30th floor? I eventually quit and landed a great job with a small company on the North Shore. The owner and his family were really awesome people. They treated me like a hard-working family member. He taught me many things about performing service on different types of large custom HVAC equipment that I never saw before. I worked with his company for about a year and a half. It was a small company with about 10 service technicians ranging in age. This job was important because here I learned my value as a professional technician and I was allowed to flourish. At this company, my interest in becoming an inventor really began to grow. I remember providing service to a man that had invented a device for the NFL. He got rich off a very simple and effective device. Also, there was a guy that worked in our warehouse that custom made a device that could be used to break free stuck compressors. As you can see, things were happening all around me. But I knew one day I would get my turn to do something big. One day I decided that I would try and do something big. I began making calls to find out how to try out for the NBA. I found out since I had no agent that I would have to go through the semi-pro league. It just so happened that my high school basketball coach was an ex-pro basketball coach with connections in the CBA. When I contacted him, he told me what I needed to work on if I really wanted to have a chance to make it in the big leagues. I worked on strengthening my game for the next few months before tryouts, and by the time they came, I felt like I was ready. Tryouts were held in Lansing, Michigan. On the first day of tryouts, we had to do 8 performance tests, shoot around, and scrimmage. This data was collected and used to rate our performance. On the second day, we started out running drills, then took a break for lunch. Few other guys and I decided to go to TGI Fridays for lunch. This is where the story gets juicy. As we were sitting there eating, talking about where we were from, suddenly all the guys quit and their eyes shifted to the door. My back was to the door, so I had to turn around to see what they were looking at. 180 degrees later, I saw the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She caught us looking, and about 20 minutes later she came up to our table and introduced herself. I almost choked on my food because this was the first time a beautiful woman had just come up and started talking to me. Well, us, but still. She was stunning and radiant, a musician, as I remember, with a very intriguing accent. Notice how basketball faded away from this story. After lunch break and the second day of tryouts, that's because I met the woman of my dreams and she became the championship basketball game that I wanted to play for the rest of my life. The only problem is she didn't know it, and neither did I. She was the most exciting part of that whole weekend. Once tryouts were over, I went back home to Chicago awaiting the results. About 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from someone with a very familiar accent. The conversation went something like this. "Hi, can I speak to Robert?" "This is." "Hi." That was about as far as she got before I interrupted her to say, "Ma'am, you are the kind of woman I would marry." 4 hours later, she was sitting in my dining room. Now what do? We talked all night long and woke up still talking. One of the best days of my life. She still wasn't like any woman I had ever met before. The closest thing I have seen to perfection. Intelligent, clean, sexy, outgoing, and interested in me. I just couldn't believe it or really appreciate it at that time. She went back home the following day and we kept in touch by phone and through email. We even used to send each other poems. It was so cute. The results from trials came in the mail about a month later. By this time I had forgotten all about them. I scored above average in all areas, but I did not get any invitation to further participate. It was okay though, because I found a new passion. Her name was Lindiwe Malongo of South Africa. About 7 months later, after we met, I moved to Lansing to be with her. I never thought I would move back to Michigan, but for the right woman, a man would do almost anything. It was the right thing to do because it is a great place to raise a family. When I arrived in Lansing, I already had a job with a very small heating and cooling company as a service technician manager. This company was probably the smallest company in town. If I recall correctly, they only had me and 2 other technicians. It was the perfect opportunity for me though because I was a leader. One day the boss called me into his office and told me he thought there was a better opportunity for me at another company. This company happens to be minority owned. It was twice as big and was one of the oldest companies in town. His reasoning was that they were too small and didn't want to grow. 2 weeks later, I interviewed with the owner of the company he referred me to, and they hired me on the spot. This job was great. I was working for a company that was well known for solving problems that other companies couldn't. The owner of this company was a brilliant man. He even taught his own seminars for schools and his team. He and I built a good working relationship and eventually allowed me to float around within the company. I did sales, service, installation, inventory, training, and management. I must say, he taught me well. He even introduced me to the community college where I was eventually hired as an adjunct professor. Now, with two great jobs and a newborn baby, the responsibilities of adulthood really began to set in. This was the point when I realized that I had to do something bigger than just a job. My wonderful wife encouraged me to become a licensed builder since I was already doing work related to that industry. I not only became a builder, but also a registered real estate home inspector. All of this happened in a timely manner because after being with the company for 4 years, I had to resign due to some immigration issues that could only be addressed from outside the country. My wife, 3 children, and I all had to go to South Africa for an undetermined amount of time. This was a serious disruption in our lives, and it caused me to resign from teaching and managing the service department. It also caused me to temporarily close my freshly started construction company, Quality Vision Construction. We left for South Africa on July 4th. I can remember watching the fireworks from what seemed like outer space. The flight was 19 hours of freezing temperatures. I had on shorts and a t-shirt because no one told me that it was only 50 degrees or so at 30,000 feet. The flight was so long that we left in the summer and landed in the winter. While in South Africa, I had many life-changing experiences. As we flew into Cape Town, it was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, for the exception of the woman that made it possible for me to be here. We only stayed there for one day, but wow, it was awesome. The beautiful Table Mountain and the pristine coastline it overlooks. The next day we flew off to our real destination, Johannesburg, South Africa. When we landed there, I thought we took a shortcut back to America. It was like any other major airport. We were met by our sister-in-law that we stayed with the whole time we were there. She was a newly published author and owned her own research company. I can remember pulling up to her mini mansion with an electric gate, and the yard was well maintained with beautiful flowers and tall thorny trees. In the backyard was a crystal clear handcrafted pool. The maid met us at the door with a warm, welcoming smile. I spent the next 6 to 7 months of my life living with only one worry: how to get my family back to the U.S. After about a month, I began to accept that we may be staying, so I began to switch gears, trying to determine how to build a life if we do stay. I started by writing a list of everything we had in the U.S. that was not here. There were a few drawbacks, though, because I had no employment documentation and I could not speak any of the native languages. My sister-in-law's house had a beautiful peach tree growing out in the front yard. In the morning, this tree was the first part of her yard to catch the sunlight, and sometimes that would make it look like it was on fire. This tree became my thinking spot, and under is where I spent many hours planning and strategizing how I would pick back up from where I left off when we get back home. Once I emptied my head and heart onto paper, I began looking for other things to occupy my time. I began looking for places to play basketball. My 3 children and I used to go for walks every day. Sometimes we would just venture off looking for parks for the kids to play at. But one strange thing, I didn't see a basketball hoop anywhere. So I asked my wife and sister-in-law about it, and they told me that it lost its popularity a while back. I couldn't believe it. What? The following day I began thinking of as many ways as possible to revitalize the spirit of basketball. I spent the next month researching basketball in South Africa. To make a long story short, I found myself sitting in front of the president of the SBA, sipping on orange juice, discussing my plan for helping reinvigorate a basketball buzz. One day we were driving to a bookstore to promote my sister-in-law's book, and I saw a public basketball court. I could not believe my eyes. This must be an illusion. When we stopped and I got out of the truck, I could have kissed the ground. There were 3 full courts, but only 2 people playing. We left a few minutes later, and she said that she would take me to the university tomorrow, a place where people were sure to be playing basketball. The next day we went to the university, and she was right. There were about 15 people playing. I began shooting around and dunking. A few minutes later, a few guys came over and asked if I wanted to play with them. That turned into, would you like to play on our team? Because we are in the semifinals and really want to win the championship. That was one of the happiest days of my life because this was pro basketball. I quickly accepted, not considering for 1 minute how out of shape I was. For the past 4 months, I haven't done anything active. It was great though because I met some really cool guys and scored 12 points in the first game and 6 or 8 points in the championship game. I sat on the bench for most of that game, but that was where I needed to be because I didn't have much stamina. Once basketball season was over, I began looking for other things to keep me busy while still working out immigration issues. So I began helping to promote my sister-in-law's book, Not Woman Enough. We traveled all over the place and met with publishers, bookstores, and even did book signings. One of the experiences I enjoyed most in South Africa was the open truck safari we went on with my wife's family. Going on a safari was a childhood dream come true for me. It was at a big resort. We ate at a fancy restaurant before going on the safari. The table we sat at was a 10-foot diameter circle with seating for about 15 people. There were live African drummers and every kind of food you can imagine, including soul food. Before we left, everyone decided to go shopping for souvenirs at the outdoor mall. There were craftsmen sitting at the entrance of the mall making all kinds of art from stuff that is usually thrown away. This was huge for me because in some cases these people made the tools they used to convert this trash into work of art. Talk about recycling. Seeing these guys made me realize that there had to be something I could make that people would be willing to pay for. Back in Joburg, under the peach tree, I spent many days pondering how to become successful. I saw people build brick homes from scratch. I mean, they made the bricks, dried them, set them, and then plastered them with what seemed like little effort. I frequently thought about the effort it would take me and my construction crew to do the same work they did, if we could. 6 months into our stay, we finally found out that we could return to the U.S. It was very exciting yet a sad day because we had begun making friends and started becoming part of the family. As we prepared to leave, it became apparent that all of us would not be able to leave at the same time for financial reasons. My wife and I discussed it for a few minutes to determine who would go and who would stay. Once that was decided, we began to make plans accordingly. Her and my youngest daughter would go home first, and we would come a week or so later. It seemed like as soon as we finished that conversation, I felt ill immediately. I had the worst stomach cramps I had ever had. It felt like someone was twisting my stomach with a pair of pliers. The morning of the day that they were leaving, I miraculously recovered. That was such a blessing because I don't think I would have been able to see them off at the airport the way I was feeling. On the way back to my sister-in-law's house, I remember saying to myself that my wife is definitely the woman for me. I followed her around the world to keep our family together while we fight our immigration battle. And now I will be on one side of the world while she is on the other. Talk about a message in a bottle. About 2 weeks later, it was our turn to leave. My oldest daughter, my son, and me were on the plane, so excited that we would see mommy, wife, sister, and daughter that I almost forgot how scared I am of flying. We made it to Amsterdam before it all started to set in. I began to panic. It was the first time I had anxiety. I was in a strange place, and it seemed like no one spoke English, and everything was written in a different language. We decided to just follow the direction everybody else was moving in. Finally, we found our way to the boarding gate and got onto the plane. It was huge. This should be a great flight, I thought. Once we took off and got to cruising altitude, the flight attendants came around with drinks, so I figured I would order a gin and orange juice, to take the edge off. I had two more drinks before the motion sickness kicked in. I made it to the bathroom just before I burst. The mess I created in the bathroom shut it down for the remainder of the flight. When I got back to my seat, it started all over again. Thankfully, I had a bag, or should I say, we had bags. Once I burst, my daughter burst, then my son. I can honestly say this was not a very good experience for us or the other passengers. When we landed in Detroit, I was so happy that we were alive that the cold weather and snow did not make me flinch. We got our bags, and a few minutes later, there she was, my best friend and wife. I was so happy to be back on solid ground that I would have kissed it if it were not covered in snow. On the way home from the airport, my wife told me everything about the last 2 weeks. She explained how one of my trusted workers took my company trucks, tools, computer, and office space. He changed the contact number on my work truck, had my dog, collected money from our tenants, and had been throwing parties in our home. The list continues. Once things settled down a bit and we had a chance to digest everything that happened, we decided to let everything we worked so hard to build go. We were not defeated though, because one thing I learned from playing basketball, there is always winners, losers, and those that just keep playing. My wife and I decided to continue playing. She decided to continue her education and eventually graduate with her master's degree. Her dream was to become a PhD, so once she finished her master's, she immediately enrolled in a doctoral program. This was the point in my life that I had to truly determine what was important to me. My answer to this question was helping my wife achieve whatever it is she sets out to do. Our decisions led to me becoming an at-home father. At first, this was a hard concept to imagine, not chasing my own personal goals. When it came down to it, she was the one positioned to improve our family situation the fastest. Thankfully, both my wife and I believe in building the family first, so I stayed home with the kids. One day, as I was sitting at home with my little bundle of joy, the light bulb came on. Just because I'm an at-home father did not mean that I could not work on my goals too. I just had to be clever about it. My goal was to be something big that would make my family proud and financially stable so that we can spend our life enjoying and experiencing it together. This is where the story gets juicy. I was looking through some old files and stumbled onto the list of things that I had come up with in South Africa under the peach tree. After reading the list, which didn't apply much here in the US, it inspired me all over again. My wife and I began talking about relocating to a different state, especially since she could transfer within her current employer, so we chose Charlotte, North Carolina. It was my job to go down and get settled in, then she and the kids would come. This is where I remember what my teacher said in college. You have your HVACR skills, you can get a job anywhere. So I began looking for upper level HVAC jobs in Charlotte. After about a week or two worth of looking, I got a hit in one of the largest companies in the Charlotte area. I can remember as clear as day when I was sitting in the interview, the service manager asked me if I was scared of spiders or snakes. Trying to maintain my manliness, I said no. They ultimately hired me, especially after they found out what school I went to. It worked out great because it paid just enough money for me to relocate. This company was okay, but their professionalism had a long way to go. It took me about a week or two before they gave me my own truck, and once I got it, I had to clean it out because it was full of dried up spit, or what I call cough drops. One thing often leads to another. They sent me all over the place, which was a big favor because being in a big city, you can learn your way around and make new friends easily. That is one of the benefits of being in the service industry that I really like. Sometimes I would see things or go places that if I didn't work on the road, I probably wouldn't have experienced. I remember when I first saw a cotton field in South Carolina. It gave me the eeriest feeling. So did some of the people I work with. There were many more experiences that led me to resigning from this job. First, I was cleaning an air conditioner one day that was surrounded by leaves. I started moving them away from the outdoor coil, and about a minute later, the leaves started moving by themselves. I freaked out like, what the? It was a lizard or something like that. I ran to the truck for a moment. On the way there, I caught a glimpse of a snake crawling away from my truck. Frightening, isn't it? I have to admit that I was on edge most of the working day, except when I was driving down the highway. It was really hard to give the customer what they were paying for, because crawling in the mud under a house with deadly snakes and spiders, I just didn't have the courage to do it. This was a major conflict for me because I cannot properly diagnose or fix a problem when I'm scared. While working for this company, I met a retired police officer that was very skeptical about service technicians. His air conditioner finally broke after about 20 years, and he did not want to hear anything about replacing it. That made for great conversation. I proceeded to diagnose his heat pump and determined that he needed a new capacitor. When I told him what the problem was and that we could fix it, even better, he could watch me make the repair, that really lightened the mood because no one ever did that before. He and I talked about Charlotte and all it had to offer for a young family man. By the time I left his house, I knew that I wanted to open my own business again. Frank was his name, and he told me if I had planned to be on the business scene, he knew a young man that ran a business networking website. I took his information and followed up with him that evening because I was in Charlotte all by myself without much to do at that time. He and I met for coffee, and we hit it off right away. We talked about our professional backgrounds and different business ideas. That evening I decided to open an air filter changing service. About a week later, I was down at the county clerk's office applying for a DBA to launch Queen City Air Filter Service. I had only been in business for about a week or so before I started thinking of ideas that would make my job easier or give me an edge over the competition. I came up with my first invention, which was a condenser air filter. I just knew this was a great practical idea until I sat down with an attorney and he told me I could not patent it. I made a prototype anyway, just to see how it would work. I marketed my business to nearby strip mall and to random people in the community. Before long, I had a few commercial customers, so I decided to upgrade my cell phone to a smartphone. This gave me GPS, two-way radio, and mobile email, everything I needed to streamline my business. There I was, sitting in the kitchen, tinkering with my new BlackBerry phone. Wow, what a wonderful feeling, my first smartphone. I sat there scrolling through the different applications thinking how I could use this piece of technology to organize my business and make money. After about a week I started to get frustrated with my new phone because the buttons were so small that I made frequent typos when composing text messages. I started playing with different ways to use the phone, hoping that I would figure out an easier way to use it. First I tried with one hand. That was almost impossible, so then I tried with both hands. What I eventually figured out was that what worked best for me was to use both thumbs and split the keyboard down the middle. I would then limit each thumb to pressing only the keys or icons on its side. This technique worked best for me, but it was still a challenge because I had to use both hands, which meant that it wasn't very functional for multitasking. Although I have to admit that I liked the phone and the prestige it added to my professional appearance, so I began looking for an accessory that would make it easier to use. I searched for about 2 weeks, and the only thing I found was a pen stylus. A pen stylus could work to improve accuracy, but it would still be a hindrance because I would have to hold something in both hands. Living in Charlotte by myself gave me a lot of free time, so I spent a fair share of it playing with my new cell phone. One day I was sitting in my kitchen struggling to send a text message. I pressed send and sat there for a few moments before thinking, if there was a text messaging accessory, what would it look like? How would it work? I pondered for a minute, then began looking online for something because I just knew there had to be something. After about 2 weeks of going to stores and surfing the web, I came up with nothing specifically for text messaging. The closest accessory I could find was a fingertip stylus, so I began researching about them. Somehow I stumbled onto a website that listed all of the fingertip stylus products that I found, but with customer reviews. I read all of the negative feedback that was listed and began to think again. If there was a text messaging product, what would it look like? How would it work? Right at that moment, I began to sketch the shape of a thumb. The next thought that came to mind was what would it take for a thumb to work better on small buttons? By the time I finished with that drawing, it resembled a thumb with a pimple on the part that makes contact with the buttons. A few days later, I contacted the young man Frank introduced me to join his business networking group. We met at a small coffee shop in South Charlotte. In the course of our discussion, he told me that he used to work in the manufacturing industry as a machinist. After filling each other out a bit, we began discussing confidential things. He shared an idea for a cool door product, and I told him about the idea I had been toying with. His mouth hit the floor when I told him what it was and how it worked. It seemed like you could hear a pin drop for a moment. We quietly talked about the idea, and he said that it should be easy to make a prototype of something like that and explained a few ways to do it. Just before we got ready to leave, a woman came over to our table and said that she had heard what we were talking about and that it was an excellent idea, that she would be interested in helping us market. What a scary moment that was. That weekend I went back to Michigan to spend some time with my family. When I got home, there were several people at my house. I had forgotten that my kind wife allowed her friend and her friend's family to move in while I was out of town. It worked out though because it gave me a chance to present the idea to multiple people at once. I was shocked by everyone's reaction. They couldn't believe that I had come up with the idea. A couple of days later, I went to the craft store to buy some molding clay, liquid latex, and a few other things to make my own prototype. I started by wrapping my thumb in molding clay, then carefully cutting out the middle to expose the cavity. Then I put the cavity back together and poured the liquid plastic into the mold. 10 minutes later, I had a hard thumb-shaped piece of plastic. I cleaned it off and put the cavity back together, then poured the liquid latex into the cavity, slowly inserting the hard plastic thumb, and positioned it so that there was space between them all the way around it. I waited with excitement for 10 more minutes, and boom, my first ugly duck appeared. I kept in contact with my friend in Charlotte because he said he was also going to see what he could make. About 3 days later, he emailed me some pictures of a rough sample that he had made. Compared to mine, his looked like a diamond. It really got me excited, and I began to realize that it was really possible. I went back to Charlotte that Sunday night. On the drive down, I kept asking myself, what did I want to accomplish in life? When I got home, I sat in the kitchen and jotted down a list of things that I wanted to accomplish. Then I asked myself, out of all of these things, what was the easiest thing to do? Out of this list, becoming an inventor seemed to be the easiest and fastest because all I had to do was file a provisional application for patent. I immediately began researching how to file a provisional application for patent. Once I had a clear understanding of how to do it, I began thinking of every possible objection a person might have against using my invention, including the objections of other products. By the time I had solidified my design, I had created 3 ugly ducklings, prototypes. This is where my emotions ran away from me. I told my friend in Charlotte that the pictures of the prototype he came up with were such an inspiration that I wanted to make him a co-inventor. He was happy and excited to be a part of it, but that only lasted for a short time because when it came time to pay for the patent, product development, and prototyping, he was not willing to contribute anything. I tried to involve him in the process, but he eventually stopped answering my phone calls and emails. When it came time to file the actual non-provisional patent, I decided not to add him as a co-inventor since he did not participate like he said he would. I found out down the line from my attorney that I should not have been trying to add him to the patent anyway, because it was on the idea, not the product development. I eventually raised enough money to make my own down payment to get the patent file and prototype started. About 6 months later, I had the production prototype, and I had received confirmation that the patent was submitted successfully. That is how I became an inventor. A special thanks to my wonderful wife and children for providing me the time and support to live out my dreams. We did it. And that is how I became an inventor.